Thunder crackled overhead as Justice Sarah Thompson peered through the rain-streaked window of her rental car, watching the unfamiliar streets of Millbrook, Missouri, blur past. The digital clock on the dashboard read 6:42 p.m., exactly 18 minutes until her keynote address at the state legal conference. Her driver, Marcus Wells, a retired police officer turned executive chauffeur, gripped the steering wheel with practiced calm despite the deteriorating weather conditions. Sarah absently adjusted her crimson silk scarf, a nervous habit she'd developed over her 15 years on the bench. The presentation materials for her speech on judicial reform were ready. They always were. Organization and preparation had been the cornerstones of her rise from a public defender's office to becoming the third African-American woman to serve on her state's Supreme Court. GPS signal lost. The automated voice chirped, its cheerful tone jarringly inappropriate for their situation. Marcus muttered under his breath, something about technology failing when you need it most. The rental car's windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, and the streets of this small Midwestern town seemed to twist into a maze of identical intersections and unclear signage. "Take the next right, Mr. Wells," Sarah suggested, recognizing the courthouse spire in the distance. "The convention center should be just past thee." Her words cut short as blue and red lights erupted in the rearview mirror, reflecting off the rain-slicked streets in a disco of law enforcement authority. Marcus immediately activated the turn signal and pulled to the curb with the smooth precision of someone who had once been the one making the stops. Sarah watched in the side mirror as the police officer emerged from his cruiser, rain pelting his broad-brimmed hat. Her hand instinctively moved toward her Supreme Court credentials in her briefcase, then stopped. 15 years of examining bias in the justice system had taught her that titles shouldn't matter when it came to equal treatment under the law. The rain intensified, drumming against the car roof like impatient fingers. Sarah glanced again at the dashboard clock. 6:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, she was supposed to be addressing a room full of judges, lawyers, and law students about the importance of maintaining dignity and fairness in the courtroom. The irony wasn't lost on her. Marcus lowered his window, releasing the warm car air into the storm. Water immediately began pooling on the leather armrest. "Good evening, officer," he said, his voice carrying the same respectful tone he used countless times from the other side of this interaction. The beam of the officer's flashlight swept through the car's interior, lingering a beat too long on Sarah's face before moving to inspect the vehicle's registration displayed on Marcus's phone. Officer Brady, as his nameplate read, seemed unimpressed by the official rental documentation and government plates. "You people need to learn to follow simple traffic signs," he drawled, water dripping from his hat onto his citation pad. "This isn't Chicago or wherever you're from. We expect drivers to follow the rules here." Sarah sat perfectly still, her posture a product of years spent commanding courtroom respect. She watched the officer's dismissive gestures, noted his assumptions, and made a mental decision. This moment, this interaction, would become more than just another traffic stop. It would become a lesson about justice, perspective, and the unconscious biases that pervaded even the most routine legal encounters. The clock ticked to 6:49 p.m. Her keynote speech would have to wait. Sometimes, the most important lessons about justice weren't taught from behind a podium, but learned from the other side of authority's flashlight beam. Officer Brady took his time writing the citation, each deliberate stroke of his pen punctuated by thunder overhead. Sarah observed him through the rain-streaked window, noting how he kept glancing at her designer briefcase, her tailored suit, her careful posture, making assumptions with every look. The weight of her state Supreme Court ID seemed to grow heavier in her pocket with each passing moment. "License and registration," he demanded, despite Marcus having already provided both. Marcus wordlessly handed them over again, his years of police experience evident in his carefully controlled movements. Sarah caught a slight tightening at the corners of his mouth, a tell she learned to recognize during countless courtroom testimonies. "And what brings you folks to our town?" Brady's question carried an edge, less curiosity and more interrogation. The rain hammered against the car roof, creating a soundtrack of tension. "We're here for a legal conference," Sarah replied evenly, her voice carrying the measured tone that had become second nature after years of presiding over complex cases. "There appears to be some confusion about the signage at that intersection." The stop sign was partially obscured by "Ma'am." Brady cut her off, emphasizing the word in a way that made it sound anything but respectful. "I've been patrolling these streets for 12 years. That sign is perfectly visible to anyone paying proper attention." Sarah felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same feeling she got when watching attorneys dismiss evidence that didn't fit their narrative. Her fingers brushed against her credentials again. One simple reveal would shift the power dynamic instantly. She'd seen it countless times. The sudden change in demeanor when people learned who she was, the scrambling deference, the hasty apologies. But then she remembered Maria Gonzalez, a defendant in her courtroom last month, who'd stood trembling as she described being talked down to by officials who assumed she didn't understand English. She thought of James Wilson, a young black lawyer who'd shared stories of being pulled over 3 times in 1 week while driving to court. Their experiences, and countless others, had shaped her understanding of justice from both sides of the bench. "Here's your citation," Brady announced, thrusting the wet paper through the window. "The fine is $275, due within 30 days. There's information about contesting it in court, though I wouldn't waste your time. The judge here doesn't take kindly to out-of-towners trying to dodge responsibility." Sarah accepted the citation, her judicial mind already analyzing the procedural issues in his statement. The right to contest a citation wasn't a waste of time. It was a fundamental aspect of due process. The judge's alleged bias against out-of-towners was an ethical concern that needed addressing. "Thank you, officer," she replied, matching his cool tone. "We'll handle this appropriately." As Brady walked back to his cruiser, Marcus adjusted the rearview mirror, meeting Sarah's eyes. "Judge Thompson," he said quietly, "I know that look. You're planning something." Sarah smiled slightly, smoothing the citation on her lap. "You know, Marcus, sometimes the most effective way to change a system isn't from the top down. Sometimes you have to experience it from the ground up to truly understand what needs fixing." Looking at her watch, now well past time for her keynote speech, Sarah made a decision. This impromptu encounter would become more valuable than any prepared presentation. She'd return to this courthouse, not as Supreme Court Justice Thompson, but as Sarah Thompson, citizen. The lesson would be more powerful that way. "Let's head to the hotel," she said, already mentally preparing for what would come next. "I believe we have a court date to add to my calendar." 2 weeks later, the Millbrook Municipal Courthouse buzzed with the controlled chaos of a typical traffic court morning. Sarah arrived early, taking in the familiar yet foreign atmosphere from an unfamiliar perspective. The municipal courthouse was a far cry from her usual Supreme Court chambers, with its scuffed linoleum floors and flickering fluorescent lights that hummed an endless drone. She chose a seat in the middle row, close enough to observe but not so close as to draw attention. Her years on the bench had taught her to read a courtroom like a book, and this one told quite a story. A teenage boy in an ill-fitting suit dabbed at his eyes with a tissue, while his mother whispered reassurances. A businessman in an expensive charcoal suit paced near the water fountain, barking into his phone about missed meetings and incompetent subordinates. "I can't believe this," the businessman announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the room. "Do they know who I am? I've got a merger meeting in 2 hours." Sarah suppressed a smile, remembering countless similar declarations in her own courtroom. Status and importance often seemed to inflate proportionally to the desperation of the situation. The teenage boy glanced at the businessman, then at his own wrinkled suit, his shoulders slouching further. The court clerk, a woman whose badge read Miss Peterson, called out names with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Anderson, Berkowitz, Chen. Each name brought forward another story, another face in the daily parade of justice. A young public defender rushed past, her arms full of files, offering quick nods to familiar faces. Sarah watched her navigate the room with practiced ease, remembering her own days of juggling multiple cases in municipal courts. The young lawyer's blazer was slightly frayed at the cuffs, a detail Sarah recognized from her early career when a new suit was a luxury that took months to afford. Thompson. Ms. Peterson called out, managing to mispronounce the simple name. Sarah Thompson. Present, Sarah responded, rising with the dignity that had become second nature. Several heads turned at her professional appearance and confident bearing. She stood out among the nervous energy that typically filled traffic court. The businessman paused his phone conversation long enough to give her an appraising look. The teenage boy straightened his posture slightly, as if her presence somehow made the room more formal. Sarah walked forward, her heels clicking against the linoleum in a steady rhythm. Ms. Peterson barely glanced up as she handed over a clipboard. Fill out sections A through D. Sign at the bottom. Return it to me. Judge Harrison's running behind today, so take a seat until your number's called. Sarah accepted the clipboard, noting how the clerk's bored tone contrasted sharply with the deferential treatment she usually received. It was refreshing, in a way. Enlightening. She returned to her seat and began filling out the form with meticulous attention, a habit that 15 years on the Supreme Court hadn't changed. Through the glass doors of Courtroom B, she caught glimpses of Judge Harrison. He sat elevated at his bench, reading glasses perched on his nose, occasionally glancing at something below his desk that looked suspiciously like a crossword puzzle. His reputation for being tough on traffic violations was well known in legal circles, but Sarah saw something else. A man who'd perhaps forgotten that behind every case number was a human story. The businessman's voice rose again in frustration. The teenage boy pulled at his collar. The young public defender shuffled her files. And Sarah Thompson, Supreme Court Justice Incognito, waited for her number to be called, preparing to experience justice from the other side of the bench. Case number 47B, Sarah Thompson, lane violation. The bailiff's voice echoed through Courtroom B with practiced indifference. Sarah approached the podium as Judge Michael Harrison finished filling in what appeared to be 7 down in his partially hidden crossword puzzle. The morning light filtering through the high windows cast stark shadows across his face, highlighting deep lines earned from years of passing judgment. Without looking up, he reached for her citation with one hand while the other twirled a pencil. Another out-of-towner who can't follow simple traffic signs, he drawled, still focused on his puzzle. Let me guess, you were following your GPS. His tone carried the weariness of someone who'd heard every excuse in the book and believed none of them. Sarah stood straight, her posture refined by thousands of hours presiding over her own court. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence regarding the circumstances of this citation. Evidence. Finally, Judge Harrison looked up, his reading glasses perched precariously on the tip of his nose. Ms. Thompson, is it? This is traffic court, not law and order. Officer Brady is one of our finest. If he says you violated the lane regulation, then. With all due respect, Your Honor, Sarah interrupted smoothly, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become her trademark. Municipal Code Section 8.452 clearly states that all defendants have the right to present exculpatory evidence in their defense, regardless of the nature of the violation. The crossword puzzle slipped slightly, revealing today's half-completed challenge. Judge Harrison's expression shifted from dismissive to curious. You seem unusually well-versed in municipal code for someone just passing through. Around them, the courtroom had grown quietly attentive. The clerk stopped shuffling papers. The bailiff straightened his posture. Even the perpetually bored court reporter leaned forward slightly. Additionally, Sarah continued, reaching into her briefcase, I have dash cam footage that clearly shows the intersection in question. The stop sign was partially obscured by overgrown foliage, and the lane markers were faded to the point of being nearly invisible, both violations of the state's traffic safety maintenance guidelines. Judge Harrison removed his glasses, setting them, and his beloved crossword aside. Ms. Thompson, in 15 years on this bench, I've heard countless creative interpretations of traffic law. But you—" He paused, studying her with newfound interest. "You're not just another driver with a Google Law degree, are you?" Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "No, Your Honor, I'm not." "Well then," he leaned forward, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine engagement, "enlighten me about your expertise in traffic law and municipal codes." The moment hung in the air like suspended dust in the morning light. Sarah could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom. The businessman from earlier had stopped checking his phone. The teenage boy and his mother watched with rapt attention. Even Officer Brady, who had just entered for his morning cases, paused by the door. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used in her own courtroom. "Before I address that, I'd like to present my evidence regarding the citation. Because regardless of who I am or what I do, justice should be blind. Isn't that the principle upon which our entire system is built?" Judge Harrison's fingers drummed once on his bench, a tell of genuine surprise. For the first time that morning, perhaps for the first time in many mornings, he appeared to be truly listening to a defendant in his traffic court. "Proceed, Ms. Thompson," he said finally, reaching for a legal pad. "You have the court's full attention." Sarah withdrew her phone and connected it to the courtroom's aging display system. The footage began to play, showing the controversial intersection from her vehicle's perspective. The early evening storm that had welcomed her to Millbrook 2 weeks ago played out in high definition for the entire courtroom to see. "If you'll note, Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice carrying the practiced precision of countless oral arguments, "at timestamp 1847, our vehicle approaches the intersection. The stop sign, which should be clearly visible from 50 feet according to State Regulation 15.43, is obscured by untrimmed maple branches until—" "Excuse me," Judge Harrison interrupted, his crossword puzzle now completely forgotten. "You cited State Regulation 15.43 without referencing any materials. Are you perhaps an attorney?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Officer Brady, still standing by the door, crossed his arms and frowned. The teenage boy in the ill-fitting suit whispered something to his mother, who shushed him while leaning forward. "Actually, Your Honor," Sarah replied, reaching into her briefcase, "I should probably introduce myself properly." She removed her credentials, the gold state seal catching the morning light. "I'm Sarah Thompson, Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court's 3rd District." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ancient ceiling fan seemed to pause its creaking. Judge Harrison's face went through a remarkable transformation. Confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, something approaching horror. The court clerk dropped her stack of files with a resounding thud. Officer Brady's stern posture crumbled visibly. The businessman who had been complaining about his merger meeting suddenly found his shoes fascinating. I see," Judge Harrison managed, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced down at his crossword puzzle as if it might offer some guidance. "Your Honor, we had no idea." "Please," Sarah raised her hand gently. "Today I'm simply a citizen requesting fair treatment under the law. The same treatment that should be afforded to everyone who enters this courtroom." She gestured to the paused video. "Shall we continue with the evidence?" Judge Harrison cleared his throat, straightening his robes. "Yes, of course. Although given your position, we could certainly dismiss this." "That won't be necessary," Sarah interjected firmly. "I'd like to proceed with my defense on its merits, just as any other citizen should be allowed to do." She turned to address the entire courtroom. "In fact, I believe this presents an excellent opportunity to examine how we administer justice at every level of our system." The young public defender in the back of the courtroom had pulled out her phone, frantically typing. News of this would spread through the legal community like wildfire. But Sarah remained focused on the task at hand, advancing her presentation to the next piece of evidence. "As you can see in this frame, Your Honor, the lane markings that Officer Brady cited in his report are severely faded. According to Municipal Code 8.452, which you're certainly familiar with, road markings must be maintained to a standard of visibility that. Your Honor, Judge Harrison interrupted again, this time addressing Sarah with genuine respect. I believe I owed you, and everyone in this courtroom, an apology. He removed his reading glasses, setting them deliberately beside his abandoned crossword. Please, continue with your defense. You have this court's complete and undivided attention. Sarah nodded, advancing to the next slide. Behind her, she could hear the teenage boy whisper to his mother again, this time catching his words clearly. Mom, I think I want to be a judge. The courtroom crackled with an electric tension as Judge Harrison removed his black robe, a gesture that transformed the space from a formal courtroom into something more intimate. He stepped down from the bench, an unprecedented move that caused the bailiff to shift uncomfortably. Your Honor, Justice Thompson, he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent room. I believe we need to address more than just a traffic citation here. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the counsel table. What occurred today forces me to confront something I've avoided for far too long. Sarah watched him carefully, recognizing the look of a judge wrestling with their conscience. She'd seen it in her own mirror many times over the years. The way I spoke to you initially, Harrison continued, the dismissiveness, the assumptions, they weren't just unprofessional. They were emblematic of a deeper problem. He turned to address the full courtroom, a problem that I suspect many of you have experienced in this very room. The businessman who had been so vocal earlier sank lower in his seat. Officer Brady, still by the door, stared at his boots. The young public defender had stopped typing on her phone, her eyes wide with disbelief at this unprecedented scene. Judge Harrison, Sarah responded, her voice gentle but firm. This moment isn't about my title or position. It's about something far more fundamental to our justice system. Exactly. Harrison nodded, color rising in his cheeks. I sat up there. He gestured to his bench. For 15 years, treating traffic court like some kind of personal kingdom. I've been solving crossword puzzles while people try to explain their situations. I've been issuing blanket rulings without truly listening. I've forgotten the most basic principle of our profession, that justice must not only be done but must be seen to be done. A tissue box appeared silently on the counsel table, passed forward by the teenage boy's mother. Judge Harrison took one with a nod of thanks, dabbing at his forehead. The thing is, he continued, his voice stronger now, I didn't recognize my own bias until I applied it to someone I couldn't dismiss. And that's the problem, isn't it? Every person who walks through those doors deserves the same respect, the same attention, the same justice, regardless of their title or lack thereof. Sarah stood quietly, allowing the moment to unfold. Sometimes, she knew, the most powerful arguments were the ones people made to themselves. I move that we take a 15-minute recess, Harrison announced, straightening his tie. And when we return, Justice Thompson, I'd like to hear your evidence in full. More importantly, I'd like everyone present to witness how traffic court should be conducted, with dignity, respect, and actual justice. The bailiff called out, "All rise," more out of habit than necessity. As people began to move, conversations erupted in hushed but excited tones. The young public defender was now openly filming with her phone, presumably live-streaming to a legal blog. Before Sarah could turn away, Judge Harrison spoke again, this time barely above a whisper. Justice Thompson, would you consider staying after we conclude? I'd very much like to discuss implementing some changes in my courtroom procedures. Sarah smiled, thinking of her missed keynote speech 2 weeks ago. Sometimes, she realized, the most important lessons about justice weren't taught in conference halls or lecture rooms. They were learned in moments like these, when truth held up a mirror to power, and power had the courage to look at its own reflection. Of course, Judge Harrison, she replied. After all, that's why I'm here. When court resumed after the recess, the atmosphere had transformed. Judge Harrison's crossword puzzle was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he sat upright, reading glasses properly positioned, legal pad ready. The gallery had swelled with courthouse staff and attorneys, word having spread rapidly through the building's corridors. "Justice Thompson," Harrison began, his tone measured and professional. "Please continue with your evidence regarding the intersection conditions." Sarah advanced through her presentation methodically, highlighting the faded lane markers, the obscured signage, and the GPS malfunction that had contributed to the confusion. As she spoke, she noticed Harrison taking detailed notes, something she suspected was a first for his traffic court. "Furthermore," she continued, pulling up a final slide, "I took the liberty of reviewing accident reports for this intersection over the past 18 months. There have been 7 similar incidents reported, all citing the same visibility issues we're discussing today." Harrison's eyebrows rose. 7 incidents. "Ms. Peterson." He turned to his clerk. "Please make a note to forward this information to the Department of Public Works immediately." He paused, then added, "And I'd like a weekly follow-up until these safety issues are addressed." Officer Brady, who had remained in the courtroom, shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, if I may." He stepped forward. "I was unaware of these previous incidents. Had I known—" He turned to Sarah. "Justice Thompson, I apologize for my conduct during our interaction. I failed to consider there might be legitimate safety concerns at play." Sarah acknowledged his apology with a gracious nod, noting how the teenage boy in the gallery was watching the exchange intently, learning how professionals could admit mistakes and grow from them. Having reviewed the evidence, Harrison proclaimed, his voice carrying the weight of genuine consideration rather than routine dismissal, "I find several compelling factors. First, the documented safety issues at the intersection. Second, the multiple similar incidents reported. And third, the incomplete road maintenance that contributed to this situation." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "However, what strikes me most is not the evidence itself, but the way it was presented. Justice Thompson chose to stand here not as a Supreme Court justice, but as a citizen seeking fair treatment under the law. She prepared her case thoroughly, respected the court's procedures, and demonstrated how our justice system should work at every level." The young public defender in the back was still taking notes, her pen racing across her legal pad. The businessman who had been so impatient earlier now sat transfixed, his merger meeting apparently forgotten. "Therefore," Harrison continued, "I am not dismissing this citation because of who Justice Thompson is. I'm dismissing it because the evidence clearly supports her defense. More importantly, I'm ordering an immediate review of all similar citations issued at this intersection in the past year." He turned to his clerk. "Ms. Peterson, please prepare the necessary paperwork to refund any fines paid in those cases." Then, addressing the full courtroom, "This court exists to serve justice, not to meet quotas or process cases expeditiously at the expense of fairness." Sarah gathered her materials, feeling the weight of the moment. What had begun as a simple traffic stop had evolved into something far more significant. A reminder that justice wasn't about power or position, but about the fundamental right of every person to be heard. "Court is adjourned," Harrison announced, but then added something unprecedented in his 15 years on the bench. "And I thank you all for helping me become a better judge today." The gallery rose, not just out of protocol, but out of respect for what they had witnessed. The day justice was truly blind in Traffic Court P. 3 months after the memorable traffic court session, Judge Michael Harrison's courtroom had undergone a transformation that extended far beyond the fresh coat of paint on its walls. Gone was the crossword puzzle, replaced by attentive listening. Gone was the assembly line justice, replaced by thorough consideration of each case. On this particular morning, Sarah Thompson sat quietly in the back row, observing the changes her unexpected visit had sparked. She hadn't announced her presence. There was no need. She was here not as a Supreme Court justice, but as a witness to evolution. "Your Honor," a nervous teenager approached the podium. The same boy who had been watching that fateful day, now here for his own speeding ticket. "I know I was going too fast, But I was rushing my sister to the hospital. She was having an asthma attack. Harrison leaned forward, his reading glasses now used for reviewing evidence rather than solving puzzles. Do you have any documentation of the hospital visit? Yes, sir. The boy's hand shook slightly as he presented his papers. And I've also enrolled in a defensive driving course. I know what I did was wrong, even if the reason was important. Sarah watched as Harrison reviewed the evidence methodically, noting how he asked clarifying questions instead of making assumptions. The entire gallery remained engaged, sensing they were witnessing real justice rather than routine processing. Given the circumstances and your proactive steps toward responsibility, Harrison announced, I'm reducing the fine and ordering community service with our local ambulance corps. Perhaps you can learn proper emergency protocols for future situations. The boy's relief was palpable. Thank you, Your Honor. I actually want to study law now. After what I saw in this courtroom a few months ago. Harrison's eyes flickered briefly to the back row, a slight smile crossing his face. The law is a noble profession when practiced with conscience and care. As the morning proceeded, Sarah noted other changes. Officer Brady, presenting evidence in a different case, now included photographs of road conditions and visibility factors with his citations. The court clerk, Ms. Peterson, had implemented a new filing system that prioritized evidence review before hearings. Even the perpetually rushed businessman from that day had returned, this time as a volunteer court translator. During the lunch recess, Harrison approached Sarah's seat. I was hoping you'd come back, he said, taking off his reading glasses. Your visit changed more than just my courtroom procedures. It changed my perspective on what justice really means. Sarah stood, smiling. I've heard about your new initiatives, the mentor program for first-time offenders, the community service options, the traffic safety council, all inspired by one traffic stop. Harrison chuckled. You know, I spoke at the judicial conference last week, shared our story. Several other judges are implementing similar reforms in their traffic courts. Ripples become waves, Sarah replied, thinking of the young public defender who had filmed that day. Her blog post had gone viral in legal circles, sparking discussions about bias and accessibility in local courts nationwide. As they walked toward his chambers, Harrison gestured to the newly installed suggestion box by the courthouse entrance. Today's morning session. That teenager with the asthma emergency. Last year, I would have just imposed the maximum fine without hearing his story. Now, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Now I understand that every case deserves its day in court. Really in court, not just passing through it. Sarah thought about her missed keynote speech months ago. No prepared presentation could have accomplished what this real-world encounter had achieved. Sometimes the best lessons about justice weren't taught from podiums or benches, but through the humble recognition that true authority came from how you treated those with none. You know, Harrison added as they reached his door, that crossword puzzle you caught me doing. I found something better to focus on now. Solving the real puzzles of human justice, one case at a time.